but we were talking about the signs of depression, the signs of suicide, and so forth. But sometimes just signs alone are interesting and sometimes rather provocative. And I've, over the years, have kept a record of different signs that I've seen in different places: odd signs, strange signs, funny signs, actually. And one is, it had a sign in a restroom and said, "Toilet out of order, please use the floor below." That wasn't exactly what they had in mind. This was a sign I saw in a laundromat. It said, "Automatic washing machines, please remove all your clothes when the light goes out." No, that's not quite what that. In a Memphis store, Memphis, Tennessee, department store, it said this: "Bargain basement upstairs." How does that work? This was in a sign outside of a second-hand shop. "We exchange anything: bicycles, washing machines, etc. Why not bring your wife along and get a wonderful bargain?" Oh well. This is one of my favorites, though. It was a notice in a health food, the window of a health food store, and said, "Closed due to illness." It's a health food store. Okay, yeah. So sometimes signs can mean some strange things. And in fact, statements can be made that are unintended. I remember reading in a church bulletin, it said, it said in the explanation for the morning and evening services, it said, "The sermon this morning is Jesus walks on the water, and the sermon tonight, searching for Jesus." Well, I hope not. It says, and then another one was, another church bulletin said this. It said, "Ladies, don't forget the rummage sale. It's a chance to get rid of those things not worth keeping around the house. Bring your husbands." There was one other one I was going to share with you. Yeah, at the evening service tonight, the sermon topic will be, "What is hell? Come early and listen to our choir practice." Somehow there was something missing on that one, too. Another one that was just really kind of questionable. It says, "The ladies of the church have cast-off clothing of every kind. They may be seen in the basement on Friday afternoons." This is my all-time favorite, though. And this is about, we just got finished, we've been talking about low self-esteem. We're going to be talking about that again in this moment. "Low self-esteem support group will meet Thursday at 7 p.m. Please use the back door." Don't dare come in the front door, embarrasses. Well, anyway. So we're going to talk about change, the footprint of change. I think that's what we have. We have Breakthrough up there now. But we're going to talk a little bit about this. And I'm going to start with a passage in Scripture in James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. It says this: "We are to take joy in our trials." Remember that? Take joy in our trials. So the question is, what does that possibly mean? I mean, are we supposed to be masochists? Are we supposed to cheer when our business fails or our jobs are lost? Are we supposed to celebrate the collapse of our marriages, or high-five it when someone sues us, or break out the champagne when our house is going to be foreclosed? No, that's not what it means. It says it gives us joy then because we believe that God is at work in our person, crafting something even better. Joy, when it uses the word joy, it noticeably does not use the word happiness. Joy is a supernatural delight in the purpose of God. That's joy. That's the joy that James was talking about. It doesn't mean we'll always be happy in that joy. Happiness is happenedness. Happiness is actually situationally determined and circumstantially driven. I'm happy because the Packers won. But the next week they lose, I'm unhappy. It's circumstantially driven, is it not? We can be happy about some things and not happy about other things. But joy is trans-situational. It's contentment. It's a settled feeling. It doesn't matter whether things are going well or not going well, I still feel at peace. That's what real joy is meaning. It so happens that God never wastes an experience. Instead, he uses these occasions to grow us in surprising ways. Remember this is an axiom to always remember. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Make sense? There's so many people treat their problems by running from them. And I want you to see a brief film clip. It's from the movie Left Behind. But it's a pilot. He's a pilot and he's leaving. He's had a difficult marriage and his daughter is trying to convince him to stay, to face the problems and deal with them instead of running. It's a very interesting interaction. The daughter, in this case, has more wisdom than the father. But you can take a look at the film clip.
Dad, where are you going?
You heard me tell your mother I have to go to London. I have to work.
What about Remy?
I see that your bags are all packed, ready to go.
You know I have exams. I have to go.
And I have a flight. It's called a job. Welcome to the real world. So that your mother has all those people coming over, and I just can't listen to it.
They're not my favorite people either. You know what? Maybe we could show her some support.
Well, what about her? What about her accepting what the rest of us think?
You know, she's on me too, but at least I listen. You know, sometimes I even pretend to take an interest. It's not like she's hurting anybody.
I wouldn't say that.
You know, maybe I should try talking to her instead of running away all the time.
Good luck on your exams, sweetheart.
That was a good example of how sometimes people just spend their whole life running away from the problems that beset them. I deal with this in marriage counseling all the time, and it's always sad and it never works. In fact, oftentimes when they end up in a situation that simply replicates itself again and again and again. And they often don't understand how is it that I end up in the same place. Now, there's a difference between wanting change and wanting pain relief. Any therapist who is worth his salt knows something about people who come through his door. And that is that they don't necessarily want change. They may just want pain relief. In fact, there's a point at which in therapy we often call the critical period therapy, which is when a person comes in and they share all their troubles and their struggles and all the rest. They share it all, they get it all out, and now they're feeling a lot better. Remember we talked about that in catharsis, and they're feeling better, and they think, I've got what I came for. I feel much better now. In other words, they're just looking for pain. They're on the cusp of really getting to the point where they can really make honest change that will change their lives. But they fear that change. And so they say, I feel better, I don't need therapy. And so they leave, and you know good and well what's going to happen. They're going to be back again, either to you or to somebody else. But they're going to be back because they never solved anything. And there are a lot of people that they're coming in, assume they all want to change is a misnomer. If you do assume that, you're assuming the wrong thing. Because some of them simply want pain relief. There's also the problem of secondary gain. Like any behavior, depression can be reinforced with unintended payoffs. For one thing, for example, when we're depressed, there are lower expectations that are placed upon us. Fewer demands are put on us. More attention sometimes, more sympathy. There's a lot of subtle reinforcements for staying depressed. But one of the most powerful ones are sometimes the ones the least seen. I had a young man come to see me, and I was the 7th therapist he was seeing. I thought, well, this would be interesting. And talk about being over-therapized. But he came in, and he was about 27, 28, never held a job for more than a couple weeks, was obviously depressed, and who was basically non-productive. And his parents were just really worried about him. They kept sending him to, and he was still living at home, by the way, and he didn't make any money, so he had to live at home. And so he's living there, and the parents were terribly worried about him, and were paying for all of the counseling, of course. And they'd send him to this therapist, that therapist. No, it didn't work. Finally, he came in. So he comes in and he says, he talks about it and I said, well, what have you done with other therapists? Certainly didn't want to repeat anything. And so I found out, and he tried different social skills training and this and that and other kinds of things. And then he said something. Then something happened that was really interesting. I said, well, how do your mom and dad feel about it? Oh, well, they're kind of concerned over. And I said, well, what kind of relationship do they have? And he then got very quiet and didn't talk much, became almost nonverbal. And I said, would you mind if I had your parents come in? I could just talk to them, just have one session with them, just kind of get a feel landscape. And he, like that, sat up bolt right in his chair and said, yeah, that'd be fine. That'd be fine. He said it with an eagerness that really took me back, but I had a suspicion. And so I said, okay. And so I brought the parents in. And I talked with them, and they, of course, came in. They were both wringing their hands about their son and how, he's been so depressed, and we just don't know how to. Nothing seems to help. No therapy seems to work. And we just don't know what's wrong, and so forth. And then it came out. I started asking questions. We talked about those things for a while. And then I started asking about their relationship, and I soon learned that their relationship was hanging by a slender thread. There had been long simmering conflicts and anger and bitterness in this couple that had existed for years. And this couple was only a couple in form, not in reality. I mean, they were divorced in their emotions toward each other. And it was explosive. It was that part of it was a pretty explosive part of the counseling session. And so I realized, and they tried to redirect it away from their marriage back to their son, and so I didn't need any more. I had the information I needed, and to make a long story short, what happened was this: this young man was staying depressed because if he got better, his parents would divorce, and he knew that. And he did not want his parents to divorce. So he had appointed himself as the sacrificial lamb to stay the identified patient so his parents would continue to be concerned about him so they wouldn't break up. He didn't want his parents to divorce. So the reinforcement for his depression was not immediately visible, but then it became evident. The reason he was so resistant to all the therapies he had been through before is because none of them addressed the real issue, which was his parents. And he was succeeding in keeping his parents together by staying the patient. And he would never let go of his depression until the situation with his parents was resolved. You see, that's how depression can sometimes be reinforced and kept alive because it serves another purpose, a purpose you may not immediately see. Now, when it comes to depression, a lot has to do, and we mentioned when we were talking about drugs, remember we were talking about how our perception, our thinking impacts the degree to which we think about what it means to be high, and then we have procedural memories about what it takes to get high and all the rest, and all these form cravings which form the addictive behavior and finally get the reward of being high again. That whole thing has to do with the importance of thought life, that emotions arrive as a result of cognitive appraisals, of a combination of our perception and our thinking, and we say, this is what's going on in our life, and we talk to ourselves on a constant basis. Every person in this room does that, by the way. We all do that. You cannot not think. Is that not true? As long as you're awake, you're thinking. And not only that, you're not only thinking, but it's a constant commentary going in your head every single day of every event that happens in your life. And in fact, you are writing the story of your life in your head by means of a narrative that goes on constantly in your head. If something's happening, you're stuck in traffic, I can't take this traffic, I hate this traffic, what's wrong with me? I'm still commenting on the event, am I not? Because we cannot not think. When someone says, if you ask them, well, what do you think? Oh, nothing. They don't really mean no, nothing. because they are thinking, but this is something they don't want to share. There's no such thing as a blank mind. So there's a narrative going, and that narrative is like a documentary. Like, for example, if you are watching a documentary and you're watching the scene, and then there's a voiceover telling you what you're seeing. In a documentary, that's typically what happens. And you're listening to the person talk about what you're looking at. This is a lot like what we do to ourselves. We have a narrative going in our head about all the episodes and events of our life. And so that narrative is in a language, right? And that language is one of two types. We're either narrating our life internally by need language or by preference language. If it's need language, we're in trouble. If it's preference language, we're in good shape. You say, what do you mean? Well, you say, well, first of all, what do you mean by need language? Need language is language related to a need. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. It's related to a need. And we say, well, then ask the question, what's a need? A need is something that's necessary for survival. It's necessary for survival. For example, we have very few needs in life. We have a need for air, a need for food, need for water, need for shelter. There are very, very few actual needs for survival, are there not? Most everything, what you do, where you live, the car you drive, the people you develop as friends, the job you have, the vacations you take, the house you live in, the neighborhood that you are living in, everything is a matter of preference, choice, right? But there are a few things that are not. You don't have a choice not to breathe. You're going to die. You don't have a choice not to eat. You're going to die. So there's a few things that are basic needs that are necessary for survival, but there are very few in number. So what happens if a need is thwarted? Let's take the need for air, for example. Let's say I walk over to you, and all of a sudden I lunge towards you, and I take my hand with an iron grip, place it over your mouth and nose, and hold it tightly so you can't breathe. What will you do if I did that? Yeah, you'd fight me. You'd fight me and you'd beat me off. Say, what's wrong with you? Get off of me. And you try to pull my hand away from my mouth. And let's say I've got an iron grip. And you start kicking me. And the longer your oxygen debt accumulated, the longer I held there, the more panic you would be feeling, wouldn't it? Pretty soon you'd be punching me wildly, trying desperately to get me off of you, because you're going to die if you do. You're not going to sit there, oh, well, he's done. I know he's done. You're not going to do that because your life is at stake. It's a need. And he's cut off your need for air. And so you panic. That's what happens. This is what happens in drownings. When people are drowning, what is a lifeguard is trained how to subdue somebody. Have you ever read about some do-gooder who says, oh, there's somebody drowning, they run out to save him, and they get pulled down with them, and they drown? And it's a tragedy. That's because they don't know that person is in full-scale panic, and when they arrive, they're going to grab a hold of them and drag them down. Even though that means that their own death, they're not thinking. Their emotional brain is taking over, it's hijacked their rational brain. And so consequently, they are in full panic mode. And so a lifeguard is trained how to seduce somebody so they don't drown in trying to rescue someone. Because panic is always the response to when a need is thwarted. That's the problem. If I were in a crowded theater and I yelled, fire, everybody would be trampling each other to get out of the room. Remember that terrible experience in Colorado in the theater, and the guy stood up and he started firing away? What they didn't tell you, of course they told you about the shooter and people died from gunshot wounds and things like that, but what they didn't tell you is how many injuries were incurred by people trampling each other trying to get out the doors, but there were. There were a lot of people who were injured who were never hit by gunfire, but they were hurt and being trampled trying to get out. Because people are not thinking, they're just running wildly. Because they're in a total state of panic. Why? Because their survival's at stake. That's why. Well, what if I take something, that's what happens when a need is thwarted. What if I take something that's not really a need, it's really a want, it's really a desire, it's not a need, it's not necessary for survival, but I convert it psychologically in my mind into a need. Like, for example, let's say I want your approval, okay? I want your approval, but I don't tell myself I want your approval. I tell myself I need your approval. Well, that subtle change is huge, because now that I've said I need your approval, now I've turned it in my head into a need state, right? So now if you don't give me approval, I start to panic. I'll do anything to get your approval. I've seen people sacrifice their moral values just to get the approval of somebody that they deemed important. This is what happens among teenagers when for peer approval. They say, I need the peer approval. They're telling themselves that, and they'll do things. They will be sexually active. They'll be in drugs. They'll do crimes. All the things against their better judgment. Why? Because they feel they have to do that in order to please the peer group, because the peer group is all important to them. Why? Because they say, I need peer approval. So out of panic, they do the very kinds of things that their own more sober thinking would tell them, don't go there, and they do it anyway. And that's what happens because we are using need language to describe something that's not a need. And this is what we do all the time. This is why we are so emotionally distraught a lot. Is because we use need language rather than preference language. Let me give you a perfectly normal example. Let's say, and I don't know if you have traffic jams here or not, but we have them in Portland. And let's say I'm going to my office and I come rounding the corner and it's a sea of red lights, traffic jam, screeching to a halt. And I'm on a tight schedule. My appointment's going to be arriving at any moment, right? And so I'm looking at my watch. Oh no, I'm going to be late. Honk, honk, honk. I can't stand this traffic. I hate this traffic. And this is need language. I can't stand it. It's awful. It's terrible. It should be different. It's hot. And I'm constantly beating it, that story. In other words, this is all the kind of need language. It's awful. It's terrible. I can't stand it. It should be different. It has to be. I have to get to my appointment. I have to, you see. And so if I do that, if I say, oh no, look at the time, I've got to get to my appointment. Oh, what am I going to do? I'm going to be late. I hate this traffic. Now I'm flooding my brain with need language. Well, what does need language do? Creates panic. Isn't that not true? That's what we said. So now I'm honking. I've seen people do crazy things, going up wrong way on-way ramps, going over the median strip, doing anything to get out because they're desperate to get there. I'm going to be late. But you know the thing about it is? It's all prompted by need language. Now, preference language would be, oh, it's disappointing. I wish I could get there on time to my appointment, but it doesn't look like going. It's not the end of the world. In other words, I'd like it, but it's my preference to be there on time. But if I don't, it's not the end of the world. But if I'm using need language, oh, I got to get to my appointment. This is terrible. I'm going to be late. I just got to get there. I'm getting desperate as I talk, isn't I? Right? Because I'm using need language. And need language greatly exacerbates the emotional content of our internal narrative. Greatly increases it. And so every time I use need language, this is what happens in road rage. A person goes by him and he doesn't like the way he's driving. I hate people like that. And they do crazy things. I've seen people do crazy things. And they're telling you, I hate people who do those things like, that guy ought to be, run him off the road. And they do crazy things. All at the behest of road rage because they're using need language to describe that event to themselves. You see what I'm saying? And this is how people get depressed. People get depressed because their life sinks in their own narrative. They say, it's awful, it's terrible, I can't stand it. It's amazing how much we exacerbate our own emotional states by the kind of verbiage we use that relates to need language is only relevant if there is a true need. And there is never, almost never, a true need at stake. How often is there? I often tell people, if you're flying at 30,000 feet and you hear it coming across the intercom, you'll please note on your left side, on the starboard side, you'll notice if you look out the window, there are two parachutes. That's your pilot and co-pilots parachuting to safety. The plane has got some mechanical difficulties. Thank you for flying United. Yeah, I think then you go, oh my gosh, we're going down. Then you have every right to use all the need language you want because there's a need state, definitely, right? Survival truly is at stake. Then you can feel free to use all the need language you want. But how often is our survival really at stake? Almost never. And believe me, if you're in a traffic jam, you're not even moving. Your survival is not even close. And so all I'm saying is this: when you start to get upset about something, tap into your internal phone line. Listen to what you're saying. How you're describing this event to yourself. If you hear all this kind of need language, I have to, I must, I've got to, it's terrible, it's awful, I can't stand it. If you're hearing that kind of language, then you know that you are using language that will naturally inflame your feelings, and you're going to be increasingly upset, and you're probably going to, and may eventually, if it is chronic, lead to depression. And so you're constantly talking about, so listen to it. And so if you hear need language, then just ask yourself one question. Just one. I'm making it as simple as possible. Just ask yourself this one question. If you say, oh gosh, there is need language there. Then ask yourself one question. Is my survival at stake? And you know when you ask that question, you'll start laughing. Because it'll be so ludicrous. I mean, like, are you kidding? I'm sitting I'm not even moving. How can my survival be at stake? Of course it's not. Well, then why are you using need language if it's not at stake? Oh, I guess that's true. So then at that point, you substitute in preference language. Well, I'd like to be on time, but it's not the end of the world if I don't. All of a sudden, you can just feel your body going down. I've done this. I've had this experience. I've been in traffic jams, what I've described, and I can feel myself getting tense behind the wheel, and then I just listen to my language, and I say, I got to get to that appointment. I'm going to be late. And I think, no, I don't have to get to that appointment. It's not the end of the world. You know, they will call again. I can make, at most it's inconvenient. That's about the most I can say about it. Inconvenient, maybe a tad embarrassing, maybe. But they'll understand when I tell them I was caught in a traffic jam, and we'll reschedule. But you see, I'm saying, but if I say, it's awful, it's terrible, I got to get there, I'm using need language that's totally inappropriate. And so I've emotionally got myself wound up. And I said, how was your day? It was a miserable day. What do you mean a miserable day? Oh, it was awful. I mean, I got caught in this traffic, and I was late, and then it started being late, and everything started off, and all my clients were late. I remember one man who came in one time and said, this is the worst day of my life. Oh, really? And he says, everything went wrong today. Everything went wrong. I said, oh, it did. Well, how did you deal with that accident on the way to work? How did that happen? I bet that was tough. And he said, what accident? Oh, you didn't have an accident? You made it to work without an accident? Oh. I thought everything had gone. Okay, I got it. So you made it to work. Okay, well, how did it work when you walked in the office and the boss said you were fired? But that was pretty tough. Well, he didn't fire me. Oh, you mean that went okay? Oh, yeah. And okay, I just thought maybe. And well, what happened when that other employee came to you and had a raging fight with you? Well, that was pretty bad, wasn't it? Oh, I didn't have any fight with her employee. Oh, I thought maybe everything gone wrong. I thought maybe that. And I after about 5 minutes of saying that, he said, I know. It was one thing. Two things went kind of sour today, and that was it. All the rest of the things were pretty good. Then he realized. He said, it's true. I have colored the entire day by two events. And I've been feeling rotten until this very moment when I realized what I'm doing. I had a woman come in. She was filled with anxiety. I mean, she was pacing, and she'd sit, and she'd fidget, and she was like this. And she says, all my friends think I'm driving them nuts. She says, I'm so nervous. I've been so nervous for so long. I'm just so upset, and I just can't calm down. I'm nervous about everything. I'm worried. She was a great anxious depressive, and she was catastrophized about everything. And so I introduced her to this whole idea of need language and what she was doing to herself versus preference language. And I said, here's what I want you to do. For the next 2 weeks till I see you next time, what I want you to do is just keep a record. Just make a mark every time you catch yourself using need language. And then she knew what it was, so she said, okay, I'll do that. 2 weeks later, she came in, and she was like a different person. I mean, a totally different. She came in, and she was calm and relaxed. She sat down in a chair. I said, what's happening? She said, let me tell you what happened. She said, I left here, and she says, I started keeping a record of all the times I was using need language, and I began to realize I don't use anything other than need language. I never even ever use preference language. I use need language every single day, every minute of every day. I realize no wonder I'm upset all the time. I'm catastrophizing about virtually everything. And I'm saying needs are at stake every time, and I know now needs are not at stake. And so she said, on her own, she decided to do this. She said, I decided to switch over. When I catch myself doing need language, I'd stop, and I'd say, no. Preference language would say, it's not the best, but it's not that bad, and I can handle this. And I may not prefer it, but it's okay. And she said, I started doing that, and she said, after a while, I started doing it more and more. And she'd only changed about maybe 20% of her thinking. But she said, it has reversed. My friends wonder what's happened to me. She says, they've never seen me this calm. And she said, I never realized how much energy I lost over the kind of language I use to describe events to my life. And that's and so our thought life is extraordinarily important in this regard. And using need language will only exacerbate every problem you have, every internal struggle you have. The Apostle Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4, 8, and 9, brilliant statement. Apostle Paul had been through all sorts of things. You know, he'd been beaten, he'd gone through all sorts of terrible experiences, and it would be natural to ask him, Paul, how do you keep your head above water? How do you just keep from, I mean, he'd been in prison, he'd been stoned, people had mocked him, on and on the list goes. And he said, how do you keep your head above water? I'm sure he was asked that question many times. And my guess is that in 2 Corinthians 4, 8, and 9, in his second letter to the church of Corinth, that he had been asked that question, and he's addressing it. Because he says this, he's describing their experience, and he says this, we are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. We're struck down, meaning we're discouraged at times, but not destroyed. You know what he's doing? I don't know if you remember the Apostle Paul when he first became a Christian. He was, he'd been around killing all the Christians and so forth, and then he was met on the road to Damascus. He became a believer, and he was a spitfire. He was a very intellectually brilliant and very emotionally intense guy. And he had fallouts with Barnabas. He had a fallout with Mark. He had a fallout with the Church of Jerusalem. And this guy was a bull in a china shop at the beginning. He was always upset about something. But as time went on, he ministered for 20 years. As time goes on, he gets calmer and calmer and more mellow, and he's able to channel that energy in more constructive ways, so that by the end of his career, he's writing a letter to Timothy. And Timothy's just now taken the head position, bishop of Ephesus, church at Ephesus, a very raucous church. And he says, let me give you some suggestions of how you might handle the people who cause problems. Here he's now the ultimate diplomat. And you say, this is Apostle Paul? But you know what he said to the church at Philippi? He says, I have learned to be content. He says, you know what I was like. I wasn't content before, but I have learned. God has taught me how to be content. And how did he teach him to be content? He's now giving the answer to that in 2 Corinthians 4, 8, 9, when he says, I don't use need language anymore. I pummeled myself with need language day in and day out. He says, we're afflicted in every way. In other words, he was just stating the reality. Sure, we're afflicted, but we're not crushed, which is a need language term. We're perplexed. Sometimes we're not sure how God is working, but we're not driven to despair. That's a need language term. We're persecuted, which is stating the obvious, but we're not forsaken. That's a need language term. We're struck down, as we get discouraged sometimes, but we're not destroyed. See, he said, I don't go there in need language. You know what I was like. I used need language right and left before. And I was constantly upset about everything. You know what I was like. Before I was a believer and after I was a believer. You know what I was like. But God has taught me that if I can just get away from using need language and pummeling myself with that, and I begin to realize that the preference language is much more powerful, much more relaxing, much more rational, then I begin to experience a whole different life. And that's exactly what Paul was saying. And so this is the clearest place in the entire Bible that talks about a preference versus need language. And he's saying, avoid the need language. Learn from what I've done. Avoid need language. Embrace preference language. And then we must challenge our false beliefs by asking where the evidence is for them. Sometimes we accept our beliefs without ever even looking at them or challenging them. We just assume they're true. We never ask for any evidence. It's funny, isn't it, that we will go to great lengths. If you're going to buy a car, would you just call up a person and say, hey, I'll buy that car? No, you would want to go and look at it, test drive it, see what the repair record is on it. You want evidence that it's a good buy before you'll spend money on it, right? Isn't it interesting we'll go to that much effort to find the evidence to give us the conviction to buy a car, and we won't ask for a scrap of evidence to buy an idea. And a car only lasts for a few years. An idea lasts a lifetime. Isn't that an irony? That's the greatest irony of all. And so it means then begin to challenge them in our own thinking. And sometimes that means changing your thinking by changing your behavior first. You know, we can act our way into a new way of thinking just as easily as we can think our way into a new way of acting. And sometimes it's easier to act our way into a new way of thinking than to think our way into a new way of acting. I remember a story of a woman who was struggling with self-esteem, and she'd been working with this therapist, and she'd been working for several months, and she was still struggling a lot. And finally, she said, she was an executive at a large company in San Francisco, and said her company was sending her to this big confab in New York, and she felt totally inadequate to go, but she couldn't say no. So she was leaving. She says, I'm going to be gone for a month. He says, oh, you are? He says, okay. He says, here's what I want you to do. He says, if you really felt good about yourself, I know you don't, but if you really felt good about yourself, what would you do when you first arrived in New York? Because they have a banquet and get to know each other kind of thing the first night. It was a whole month-long thing. And he said, well, I would probably, if I felt good, which I don't, but if I did, I'd probably dress up and go to the banquet and interact with the people there. That's probably what I do. But of course, I'm not going to do that. I'd feel totally inadequate. I'm a real doofus compared to everybody else there. I don't want to make a fool of myself. I'm just going to go check in my hotel and bag the banquet. You know, I just can't do that. He said, but if you did feel good, you would go to the banquet. Yeah, he says, what I want you to do is this. If you would go to the banquet, if you felt good, then what I want you to do is, even if you don't feel like it, I want you to go ahead and do it anyway. And so he said, that's all he said. And she said, she agreed. Oh yeah, well, okay, maybe I will. Then she said, and she went and she left, and she came back a month later, and she was a transformed person. He said, what happened? She said, on the plane to New York, she said, I kept thinking, why on earth did I ever agree to do this? I'm going to make a total fool of myself at this banquet. I wish I had never made this promise. But she was somebody who really, once she made a promise, she was going to stick with it. So she said, what did I do? And she said, well, it's 30 days, so it's just one day, so I'll just go ahead and do this, and then hope for the best, and hope I don't make too much of a fool of myself, and then I'll just revert to my real behavior. And that way I checked it off. I said I tried it, doesn't work, and I could end it. So that's what she did. So she arrived, she checked in, she went to the banquet, and she asked herself, as he had suggested, well, what would you do if you felt good about yourself? Well, I'd go in, I'd interact, I'd talk to him. Well, she did that. And not only did she do that, she became the star of the banquet. She talked to people really shined to her. She just thought she was great. She had a great time, and she had person after person after person say, boy, your company must be pretty sharp to have a person like you as an executive. And she walked out and she says, I was in a state of shock. And she thought, well, I could probably try it one more day. And so she tried another day. It would make a long story short, she did it for the entire 30 days. By the end of 30 days, she had an entirely different view of who she was. And sometimes people think, and this has to do with the whole nature of self-esteem, is that somehow that's somehow narcissistic to think well of ourselves. But you see, that's not what it's saying. Low self-esteem is not saying I'm a great person. What self-esteem is saying is this: I accept who I am because I am who God created me to be. Why would I ever denounce what God has created? He has created me with unique gifts and strengths. And he has he's given me the repository of these strengths that I might use them for the glory of the kingdom. Why am I putting them down and condemning them? So you see, self-esteem is really accepting the presence of God in your life and to say, he is the one that authored my life. I want to honor that. And And we were created, think of this for a moment, we were created in, by, and for love. You know, it states in 1 John chapter 4 that God isn't just loving, He is love. He's the embodiment of love. He is the definition of love. So if He is love, then that means that we have inherent lovability. Why? Because in Genesis 1, He says we were created, wow, in His image. And His image is that of love because He's inherently loving. He is love. So we have an inherent lovability because God cannot create in His own image that which is unlovable. It's not possible. God cannot create that which is unlovable. That would run against His own character. So by the very nature of your being an image bearer of God makes you inherently lovable, even if you don't believe that. See, that's where we get the truth and the lie mixed up, you were saying? And in this regard, it means starting to treat yourself differently. Sometimes I ask people, well, how are you with a friend? Oh, I'm really, let's say they're beating themselves up over something. Say, what if this had been your friend? What would you say to them? Oh, well, I'd say this, and I'd comfort them. I'd say, you know what, that doesn't really, isn't really reflect badly on you. This is this. You know, they give some narrative that was really kind and loving and supportive and compassionate. And when they get finished, I said, you know, you're really a good friend to these people. And he said, well, I try to be. I said, isn't it interesting that you're not a friend to yourself? Because if you did these very things, I'm not asking you to do anything differently. I'm just simply asking you to start being a friend to you, to start treating you the way you treat your friends. So when you start to beat yourself up, stop and ask yourself this question. What would I say or do if this was my friend? Well, I would do this and this and this. Then turn around and say, do that to yourself. In other words, you make a basic premise in that I will never treat myself differently than the way I would treat my friend. If I wouldn't treat my friend that way, I won't treat myself that way. If I will treat my friend that way, I'll treat myself that way. And so I can simply ask, how do I, because I find that a lot of people, even people who have very low self-esteem, are wonderful friends to people. They know how to love people. But the problem is, they don't do that to themselves. They don't do that themselves. It's like I use here in terms of the whole nature of worth, is like a nickel analogy. I pull this nickel, let's say I pull a nickel out of my pocket and I show it to you. See this nickel? And you say, yeah. He said, well, this nickel is worthless. It's not worth anything. You say, what do you mean it's not worth anything? Well, it's not worth anything. It's got all these scars. I point out all the scars and scabs and wear points. And see, it used to be 5 cents, but it's not anymore. It's worthless. And you think, what's wrong with this guy? Of course, it's still a nickel. It's still worth 5 cents. No, it's got all these scars. And so you take the nickel and you go to the store and say, come with me. And you go up to the clerk and say, I'd like to buy 5 cents worth. He said, can I have your nickel? Yes. And he says, I'd like to buy 5 cents worth of candy. Will this work? And the clerk looks at it and he says, of course, it's a nickel, isn't it? Of course it will. And you turn around in victory. You see, it's worth 5 cents. Now, that whole conversation would seem absurd to you, wouldn't it? Of course it's 5 cents. But why did I say it wasn't worth 5 cents? Because it's got all these scars and scabs and wear points on it. So it's all kind of beaten up. And so I think, oh, it's not worth anything. But how do we know it's still worth 5 cents? Because we know that when it rolled off the U.S. Mint, it was stamped in the image of the government, and the government said, as long as this nickel is in circulation, it will be maxed out in its worth. Is that right? And so that's when we look at money and we say, we know it's what it's worth. We don't think it's just because it's beaten up that it's not worth anything. I've had dollar bills that are all torn and everything. You still get dollars worth of whatever. Okay, so that's the nickel analogy. So that's what we do with ourselves. If we say, I'm worthless, I'm just really worthless. Well, why are you saying that? He said, well, because I blew it here and I blew it there and this happened to me and that happened to me and I screwed up this and I've done this. And you give me a long litany of all the bad things that have happened in your life. In other words, all the scars and scabs and wear points. And you say, so therefore, I'm worthless. But what are you doing? You're applying the same logic, are you not? You're saying, I'm worthless because of all the scars and scars. But you know what? You were brought into this world. You were stamped in the image of God. And God said, as long as you're in circulation, your value is maxed out. It can't change no matter what you do. You can do anything. It will not change your value. It may change the way you live your life, but it's not going to ever change your value. Nothing changes your value. But we are always attacking our value. We're always saying we feel worthless, especially when we're depressed and we have low self-esteem. So in this respect, low self-esteem is critically important. You know, one of the objectives here is this. Self-esteem and humility go hand in hand. You cannot truly be humble without high self-esteem. Did you know that? And you cannot, and if you're humble, then you have high self-esteem. So how does that work? I don't understand. Well, look at this. The goal of humility and self-esteem is exactly the same. It's not to think less of yourself. It's to think of yourself less. In other words, if I feel at peace with myself, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm thinking about you, and I'm relating to you. I'm giving out to you. I'm humbly serving you. Humility is service. It's service based on a sense of worth affirmed in Christ and of a sense of adequacy empowered by the Holy Spirit. That's what humility is. And so I'm out there reaching out to serve you. But you know, if I have low self-esteem, what am I thinking? Oh, how are you looking at me? Are you accepting me? Am I doing okay? Oh, I blew it here. Oh, why did I say that? I look stupid doing that. I'm constantly monitoring myself. I'm inward focused because when I have low self-esteem, I'm always worried that I'm going to look stupid, be stupid, act stupid, people reject me, etc. I'm always worried about that because I have low self-esteem to begin with. So my attention is where? Inward. But with humility, it requires us to what? Look outward, not inward. And so the objective is not to think less of ourselves, but to think of ourselves less. And so therefore, we are then enabled to serve others. That's humility. And that comes with high self-esteem. It does not come with low self-esteem. And then we come to, finally, dealing with your anger. You can either, in dealing with this, we actually have to realize then that we have a choice in dealing with our anger. We can either suppress it, we can repress it, we can express it, or we can confess it. In other words, we can suppress it, meaning holding it down. We know we're angry, but we're just holding it like that and just trying to keep from exploding. Or we can repress it. We can be so effective in pushing it down, we shut it off. We don't ignore it entirely. We don't even know we're angry. Some people are so disconnected from their feelings, they don't even know when they are angry. Might be more likely expressed in pain, physical pain in some way. And then, or there's express it. Express it means blow off steam, let it fly, let the shrapnel go, you know, and you hit them all with everything. But that only damages your relationship, sometimes irrevocably. So the fourth one is to confess it, meaning to talk it through, walk it out. Deal with your anger in terms of talking through to the person you have the anger toward, and talk it through. That's what confessing means. It means to discuss it, to talk it, to identify what things need to change, what ways we need to address each other so we can heal the rift that is between us. That's what confessing is. That's what healthy anger management looks like. God encouraged Job to get his anger out, did he not? He didn't say, don't say anything, don't act nice, don't ever say. No, Job was out there telling God, oh, you take pleasure. Remember we read that? You take pleasure and you smile at the schemes of the wicked, and you seem to have some perverse pleasure in making my life miserable. And I think, you're saying this to God, Job? I mean, don't you better not say that kind of, and his friends were telling him, oh, don't say that to God. If you think you're in trouble now, you'll really be in trouble. And God said, I honored his honesty. He's least honest. He's broken, but he's honest. Remember we talked about that. And what it's saying is getting your anger out on the table where God can use it. You confess it, and he can challenge our mistaken beliefs about his character and his love. But we can't do that in denial. And finally, there is the example that Jesus gives of himself. When Mary and Martha sent an emergency message to Jesus saying, our brother Lazarus is dying. Please come immediately, because they knew he could raise him up from his sickness. And Jesus does what? He waits 4 days. He finally arrives. Now get the picture. He's arrived, and his disciples didn't want to come because they said this is a death march, because they had been banned from going to Judea under the penalty of death, that they would be stoned to death if they ever set foot in Judea again. So they were avoiding, had been on the other side of the Jordan, but Jesus said, come, let us go. And so Thomas, of all people, stood up and said, come, let us die with our master. They thought it was a death march. And so they went to Bethany, and they arrive, and when they arrive, Jesus comes in. Now, Lazarus already died, and he's dead, and he's in the tomb. And Martha comes as the first one to greet Jesus, and what does she say? She says, if you'd only been here, our brother would have lived. And Martha then comes and says word for word the same thing. Now, do you hear the anger in this? Like, why didn't you come? We sent an emergency message 4 days later, and he's been in the tomb for 3 days. You were only a few hours away. You could have come. You didn't come. Why didn't you come? I thought you loved us. I thought you'd respond to that need. But you didn't come. And Jesus saw, he was delayed for a purpose, because he wanted to show that he had power over death, not just power over physical health. He had power over death. They didn't understand that. And he was going to teach them that. But he could have said, you know what? How dare you accuse me? My own disciples think we're on a death march. I'm risking life and limb, and you sit there and accuse me that I don't really love you? Who do you think you are? Can I just jump every time you... Not only that, but I came here. I'll show you. I'll shame you. Come with me. And he could have gone straight to the grave and raised him up and said, see, I did it. You were accusing me and I didn't love. Well, see what I did? But he didn't do that, did he? The first thing on his plate was this. It says that after saying a few words to him to prepare him for what's to come later, he says he walked over, put his arms around, and he wept with them. Why? Because they were angry at him. Why? Because they were hurt. Remember we talked about the hurt-anger relationship? They had been hurt, and they were angry at him because they felt hurt. They felt like they weren't loved. And the first order of business was to heal that rift. And he went over and put his arms around and wept with them. Even the people staying around didn't understand that, because they said, oh, see how he misses Lazarus. He didn't miss Lazarus. He was going to be talking to him in a matter of minutes. It wasn't Lazarus he was crying over. He was crying over the pain that his delay had caused in two people he loved. And he was then reaching out and ministering to them. And that was the first thing. And you know what he was doing, essentially? And having this recorded, he was telling the disciples, and through the disciples to us, he was saying, this is how you handle anger. You look for the hurt behind the anger. See, we only respond to anger. If somebody's angry at us, we just lash back at the same thing. Anger for anger, man. You're getting angry at me, I'll fight. And we have drag out fights. When I do marriage counseling, a lot of times they come in, they've been fighting and fighting and fighting. They just fight each other, that's all. But what Jesus was saying is, when someone is angry with you, wouldn't it be revolutionary to look for the hurt behind the anger? Because the hurt's more likely to elicit your compassion. The anger will never elicit your compassion. It'll elicit defense. But the hurt will elicit compassion. So why not look at the hurt? It would revolutionize our relationships if, when people are angry at it, we put all our effort is to find out what the hurt is behind the anger, and then address the hurt, because that addresses the real problem. And that's what Jesus was doing. He was addressing the real problem. There is no evidence at all that Mary and Martha, even before he was raised from the dead, that Mary and Martha was any longer angry, because he addressed their need at that moment to be reassured that they were loved. And he showed that. And because he understood what was behind the anger, and he was telling us, that's how you handle anger. Instead of just using force. The importance of forgiveness. If we don't forgive others, often said it leads to bitterness. And bitterness is sometimes like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. We're the ones who suffer when we are unable to forgive. And it finally leads us, as we close, to the power of prayer. In James 5:17, we read, Elijah prayed with conviction for big things. He said it prayed and it stopped raining, and he prayed again and it started raining. He said, wow, I've never had that kind of prayer. But it wasn't that Elijah was something, unusual. It wasn't somehow he had some kind of unusual power. What it was that he was faithful. He had the conviction to pray for big things. And so often we pray with a faint heart for small things. Isn't that true? Instead of merely praying that God would lift you out of your troubles, which is what we often want, we're in trouble, we're hurting, oh God, please take this away from me, make this better, make it all go away. We want to be out of it as soon as possible, just make it better. But James tells us another way to look at it. Pray that in your troubled times that he can use you in some unique way for his glory. Just because you're suffering doesn't mean you cannot be used for his glory. So you pray to that end. And then you ask him to teach you more about yourself and more about himself during this time of adversity. And then pray that God would use your struggles to in some way advance the kingdom. Prayer is a partnership with God. It's a partnership with God. In Matthew chapter 7, it says, ask. And he gives the Lord's Prayer. Disciples that ask him, how do you pray? And he describes how you pray and so forth, which is interesting because the reason they asked him to pray is that they had been raised in the synagogues. They'd heard lots of ritual prayers, but they never heard a prayer like Jesus. It was so personal, so passionate. And so they ask, tell us, how do you pray? And he then gives them the model of how they prayed. And then he says, ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall and you shall find. And knock and it shall be opened unto you. It's the great trilogy of prayer. What God is saying in that is saying, God is saying, you're in a partnership with me. When you pray, don't just ask and then sit back and wait for me to act. You seek out all your alternatives. And when you seek out your alternatives, then begin knocking on each of them. I'll open the doors, and I'll open and close the doors. You do the asking and the seeking and the knocking, and I will answer the door. In other words, he's saying, I want you to be assertive. He's calling us into an assertive relationship with him. An assertive relationship with him, which tells us that we are a partner with him in making things happen for the kingdom of God. Is there anything greater than that? Is there really? I mean, when you stop and think of it, and when it means practice good assertive skills, both with God and with each other. God is the one that says, remember in Hebrews it says, come boldly into the throne of grace. We're going into the throne of grace, into the throne of the Almighty God of the universe, and we're to walk boldly in, like we belong there. And he's saying, I want an assertive relationship with you, not some passive relationship. He's not asking for a dysfunctional relationship. He's asking for a functional relationship. Practice good assertive skills. It starts with God, but it also means being assertive with one another. Passivity says, I don't respect myself. Therefore, you withdraw and keep quiet. Aggression says you don't respect the other person, so you attack or belittle. But assertiveness says you respect yourself and the other person, so you simply share your insides and ask the other person to do the same. That's assertiveness. With passivity, you retreat. With aggression, you rebel. But with assertiveness, you serve. With passivity, you reveal weakness. With aggression, you reveal defensiveness. But with assertiveness, you reveal conviction. And finally, with passivity, we see fear. With aggression, we see arrogance. But with assertiveness, we see humility. There's that word again. We see humility, which requires high self-esteem, is it not? We are called by God to be assertive for the kingdom, but we are also to be assertive if we accept who God created us to be. So we cultivate our time with God as the wellspring of our relationship with him. Without self-esteem, you do not have the ability to be truly humble. You will never, ever reach the goal of humility as long as you feel lousy about yourself, because your attention is always going to be directed in the opposite direction that humility demands. And the beautiful thing about it is God wants us to honor and to take joy in what he's created in each of us. That's what's unique. Why don't we just pray as we close? Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this, your undying love, for creating us in such marvelous ways. But we also pray, Lord, that you would give us help, that you would help us to realize in all of its fullness what it means to be created in your image, to sense the worth that comes from being valued by the Almighty God of the universe, to understand that our worth doesn't change, and to realize that in our lovability through you, that when we reach out to a world that needs that kind of love, that we can make a difference in our lives first and then in the lives of others. That we can truly experience what humble service really means. And thereby lift us out of the morass of depression that holds us back because we can't accept who we are. We just pray, Lord, that you would bless this time together. And each of the people that are gathered in this room, you bless their lives, that you touch their lives, that you transform them into the living replica of your love. We thank you for their lives. We thank you for their interest in following you. And above all, we thank you for the fact that they desire to be all that you created them to be. Thank you for our time together. We ask all these things now in Jesus' name. Amen.